People in the city believed that Thomas DeLuca no longer had a heart. They said the war had taken it. The betrayals had hollowed it out. And the night his wife died in childbirth had buried whatever remained. Men spoke his name carefully in quiet rooms. Some called him the most powerful man in the state. Others called him the most dangerous. But the people who truly knew the story whispered something else. They said Thomas DeLuca had once loved someone so deeply that when she died, the man who remained was only a shadow wearing a suit. His mansion stood on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, an enormous estate surrounded by iron gates, security towers, and guards who never smiled. From the outside it looked like a fortress, the kind of place where secrets went to sleep and never woke up again. Inside, the silence was worse. There was no music, no laughter, no warmth. Just long marble hallways, expensive paintings, and the echo of footsteps. And on the third floor of that mansion lived 3 children who had never known their mother. Leo, Werve, and Sophia. Triplets. 3 years old. The doctors had given Thomas reports filled with complicated language. Attachment trauma. Emotional dysregulation. Developmental stress response. But Thomas knew the truth. His children were broken by grief. They screamed when strangers touched them. They threw toys at anyone who came too close. Some nights they didn't sleep at all. The nanny agency had sent 12 caregivers in 2 years. None lasted longer than 3 weeks. One left crying. Another quit after being bitten by Leo during a panic episode. The last one simply packed her bags overnight and vanished without saying goodbye. The agency eventually began using the same word every time they called. Unmanageable. Thomas hated that word. Unmanageable meant no one wanted to try anymore. But the truth was something he had never admitted out loud. Even he didn't know how to help them. So he worked. That was the one thing he understood. Balance. Control. Power. While the city slept, Thomas expanded his empire. Construction, shipping, private security, real estate. Every week another company joined the DeLuca network. Politicians shook his hand. Bankers returned his calls within seconds. Rival families stayed quiet. The city feared him. But fear had never once comforted a crying child. And the nursery upstairs remained the one place in the mansion where Thomas DeLuca had absolutely no control. On a stormy Thursday night, his black SUV rolled through the estate gates without warning. Thomas had returned from Chicago 2 days early. No one knew. Not his staff. Not his security chief. Not even his younger brother Marco. Thomas preferred surprises. In his world, surprise meant survival. Rain pounded the windshield as the vehicle climbed the long stone driveway toward the mansion. The driver glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. "Should I notify the house you're back, sir?" Thomas stared out the window at the dark silhouette of his home. "Oh." His voice was low and calm. "I want to see what things look like when no one is pretending." The SUV stopped under the front archway. The driver jumped out to open the door, but Thomas was already stepping into the rain. Cold water soaked his coat instantly. He didn't care. After days of negotiations and cigar smoke, the rain felt honest. The mansion doors opened with a coded lock, and Thomas stepped into the vast marble foyer. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Usually, the night staff moved through the halls cleaning or preparing the kitchen. Tonight there was nothing. Just silence. Thomas removed his coat and draped it over a chair before loosening the collar of his shirt. His body was exhausted from travel, but his mind was still sharp. He planned to walk straight to his study, pour a glass of whiskey, and review the reports weighing on his desk. But as he reached the bottom of the staircase, something unexpected stopped him. A sound. Lost. Almost too quiet to notice. Thomas froze. Years of surviving assassination attempts had sharpened his instincts. He knew every sound his house made. The creak of the stairs. The hum of the ventilation system. The distant rumble of the generator. This was none of those. This sound was music. A woman's voice. Say. Thomas slowly turned toward the east wing hallway. The sound was coming from upstairs. From the 3rd floor. From the nursery. That made no sense. The nursery at night was never quiet. Most nights it sounded like a battlefield. Crying, furniture moving, panicked nanas trying to calm 3 terrified toddlers. But tonight the sound was gentle. A lullaby. Thomas began walking toward the staircase. His footsteps were silent on the marble floor. The deeper he moved into the hallway, the clearer the melody became. It was soft and slow, the kind of song someone sings when they believe no one else is listening. When he reached the 3rd floor landing, the hallway lights were dim. The nursery door stood slightly open. Warm yellow light spilled into the darkness. Thomas stopped outside the door. He listened carefully. The singing continued. How steady. Peso. Something about the melody tugged at a distant memory in his mind, but he couldn't place it. His hand instinctively moved near the pistol resting beneath his jacket. Slowly, carefully, Thomas pushed the nursery door open. The sight inside froze him in place. The room looked nothing like the chaos he expected. The toys were neatly arranged, the blankets folded, and on the large rug in the center of the nursery sat a young woman in a simple maid's uniform. Catherine! He recognized her from a staffing file he had skimmed weeks earlier. But it wasn't the woman that shocked him. It was the children. Leo lay asleep against her shoulder. Lucas rested his head in her lap. Little Sophia clutched the fabric of Catherine's sleeve like it was the most important thing in the world. The 3 children, who screamed at everyone, were completely calm. Catherine gently brushed her fingers through Leo's hair as she continued humming the lullaby. Her voice was quiet but warm, the kind of voice that filled empty rooms. Thomas stood in the doorway without moving. For 3 years he had never seen this. Not once. Then Catherine shifted slightly to pull a blanket over Lucas. Her sleeve slid back from her wrists. Thomas noticed the movement immediately. It was precise. Controlled. Instinctive. That was not the movement of someone who spent their life cleaning floors. His eyes narrowed. Something about this woman didn't match the file. As if sensing the shift in the room, Catherine suddenly looked up. Her eyes met his. For a moment neither of them spoke. The most feared man in the city stood in the doorway, and the maid holding his children stared directly back at him. But Catherine didn't scream. She didn't panic. Instead, she carefully adjusted the blanket over Leo and whispered softly, "Easy, it's all right." Then she looked at Thomas and spoke calmly. "If you come in too quickly, Leo will wake up." Thomas DeLuca had been challenged by politicians, gang leaders, and federal prosecutors. But somehow, the quiet woman sitting on his nursery floor had just spoken to him like he was the one who needed instructions. And strangely enough, he listened. Thomas DeLuca remained standing in the doorway of the nursery. For a man who had negotiated ceasefires between rival crime families and stared down men with guns pointed at his chest, it was strange to realize he suddenly had no idea what to do. His children were sleeping. Actually sleeping. Leo's small hand rested against Catherine's shoulder. Lucas had curled into the side of her hip, and Sophia clutched the edge of Catherine's sleeve like it was the only safe thing in the world. The nursery, once a battlefield of broken toys and terrified cries, looked peaceful, almost sacred. Catherine slowly lifted a finger to her lips. "Quiet," she whispered gently. Thomas didn't move. Not because she commanded him, but because he was afraid of ruining whatever miracle had happened in that room. She carefully leaned forward and lifted Leo into his crib. The boy barely stirred. That alone was astonishing. Normally Leo woke instantly if anyone tried to move him. Next she lifted Lucas. Her movements were patient and deliberate, like someone who had done this 1,000 times. When she reached for Sophia, the little girl stirred and murmured softly. Catherine hummed a few more notes of the lullaby. Sophia relaxed again. Within moments, all 3 children were tucked safely into their beds. Only then did Catherine stand. She turned to face Thomas fully. Up close she looked even younger than he expected. Mid-20s, maybe. Chestnut brown hair tied loosely at the back. Tired eyes that carried more calm than fear. Most people reacted to Thomas DeLuca in one of 2 ways. They either trembled, or they tried too hard to impress him. Catherine did neither. She simply stood there. Wedding. Thomas spoke first. You're the new maid. Ness. Her answer was simple. No explanation. No apology. His gaze moved around the room again. How long have you been working here? 2 weeks. And in 2 weeks you did something 12 professional nannies couldn't do in 2 years. Catherine folded her hands in front of her. They didn't need professionals. Thomas frowned slightly. They needed someone who listened. The quiet confidence in her voice irritated him. Are you suggesting my staff doesn't know how to care for children? I'm suggesting, she said calmly, that most people try to control children instead of understanding them. Thomas crossed his arms. That sounds like a philosophy lecture. It's psychology. The word hung in the air. Thomas tilted his head slightly. Psychology. Yes. You're a maid. Catherine met his eyes. Yes. That doesn't answer the question. No, she admitted softly, it doesn't. Thomas walked slowly into the room. His presence alone could make grown men step backward. But Catherine didn't move. He stopped a few feet away from her. What were you before this job? She hesitated. A waitress. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his voice hardened slightly. That's a lie. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Catherine sighed quietly. Ness? I studied child psychology. Thomas blinked once. You studied psychology. Ness? And now you clean floors in my house. Ness? He studied her more closely. The posture. The calm voice. The careful way she had handled the children. None of it matched the profile of a maid hired through a standard agency. What? He asked. The question was simple. But Catherine understood what he meant. Why leave a profession like that? Why hide in a job like this? Why work for a man whose name filled newspaper headlines? She looked toward the cribs. Leo shifted in his sleep. Her voice softened. Because sometimes people need help who don't know how to ask for it. Thomas followed her gaze. My children don't ask for help, he said quietly. They scream. They scream because no one listens to what the screaming means. He watched her carefully. You seem very certain about that. Why? Catherine hesitated again. Then she spoke with quiet honesty. Because grief doesn't disappear just because someone is small. Thomas felt something tighten inside his chest. He turned away slightly, staring toward the window. Rain streaked across the glass. For years he had buried his wife's memory beneath business meetings and power plays. But grief had never left this house. It lived upstairs, in 3 small beds, behind 3 frightened eyes. When he finally looked back at Catherine, his voice was quieter. Every doctor who examined them said they were unstable. Catherine shook her head gently. They're not unstable. What are they? They're lonely. The word hit harder than any accusation. Thomas inhaled slowly. And you fixed that in 2 weeks. I didn't fix anything. She glanced toward the cribs again. I just stayed. The room fell silent. For the first time since entering, Thomas truly looked at her. This woman who cleaned hallways by day. Who sang lullabies in the dark. Who spoke to him without fear. Why didn't the agency tell me you had a degree in psychology? They didn't know. You didn't tell them? No. What? She gave a small shrug. Because people hire psychologists to analyze problems. She nodded toward the cribs. But those 3 children didn't need analysis. They needed someone who would sit on the floor with them until they stopped being afraid. Thomas rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Then he asked the question that had been building in his mind since he walked through the door. How did you get Leo to sleep? Catherine smiled faintly. I didn't. Then why is he sleeping? Because he trusted me enough to close his eyes. Thomas stared at the crib. Leo hadn't slept peacefully in months. He finally looked back at Catherine. You're not leaving. It wasn't a question. Catherine tilted her head slightly. That wasn't part of the employment contract. Consider it updated. She studied him for a moment. Then she said something no employee had ever dared say to Thomas DeLuca. "I'll stay." He nodded once, but then she added calmly, "On one condition." Thomas slowly raised an eyebrow. "You're negotiating with me." "I'm advocating for them." She nodded toward the sleeping children. "And what condition would that be?" Catherine's voice remained calm. "You have dinner with them tomorrow." Thomas frowned. "I run a city, and they need a father. That's not how my life works." "Then change it." Silence filled the nursery again. For a long moment Thomas simply stared at her. This maid, this psychologist, this stranger who had just demanded something no one else had the courage to ask. Finally he spoke. "What time?" Catherine smiled slightly. "6." The dining room of the DeLuca estate had never been designed for children. It was a room meant for power, a cathedral of wealth and intimidation. The ceiling stretched 2 stories high. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars above a mahogany table long enough to seat 30 guests. The walls were lined with oil paintings of landscapes and battle scenes, reminders of victories earned long before Thomas DeLuca had inherited the empire. Deals had been made in that room, alliances formed, and sometimes quiet decisions about who would not live to see the next sunrise. Children had never set foot there. Until 6 o'clock the next evening. Thomas stood outside the tall double doors with a strange tension in his chest. He had negotiated with senators without blinking. He had stared down armed men in alleyways and never felt fear. But right now, he felt something uncomfortably close to nervousness. Dinner with his children. The idea felt absurd. The doors opened as he stepped inside. The scene that greeted him stopped him completely. Catherine had ignored the formality of the room. Instead of placing the children at the distant end of the table, she had moved everything. 3 small chairs sat clustered near one corner. Bright plastic plates replaced the estate's fine porcelain. A bowl of pasta steamed gently in the center. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the air. For a moment Thomas simply stood there. This room had once been the center of his power. Now it looked like the kitchen of a family home. Catherine glanced up from tying a small napkin around Leo's neck. "You're on time," she said. Thomas walked toward the table slowly. "I keep my word." The children noticed him. The change in the room was immediate. Leo stopped tapping his spoon. Luca stiffened. Little Sophia quietly covered her eyes with her hands. The reaction struck Thomas like a physical blow. They were afraid of him. Not surprised. Not curious. Afraid. He had faced enemies with guns and never felt the sting he felt in that moment. Catherine noticed. Her voice dropped to a quiet whisper as he approached the chair. "Sit down." Thomas obeyed. "Don't stare at them," she added softly. He frowned slightly. "I'm their father. And right now you're also the giant stranger who appears in doorways." The blunt honesty would have angered anyone else. But Thomas understood something important. She wasn't insulting him. She was explaining the truth. So his dinner began quietly. Catherine served pasta to the children first. Leo poked at the noodles suspiciously. Lucas watched Thomas carefully. Sophia kept one hand wrapped tightly around Catherine's sleeve. The silence stretched. Thomas cleared his throat. "What should I say?" Catherine leaned slightly closer. "Ask them about their day." Thomas nodded awkwardly. He looked toward Lucas. "How was your afternoon?" Lucas stared at him without answering. Thomas tried again. "Did you play today?" Still silence. Leo suddenly grabbed a handful of spaghetti. Thomas watched him carefully. The boy threw it. The noodles struck Thomas squarely across the chest. Red sauce splattered his white shirt. A single meatball rolled slowly down his thigh. The room froze. 2 security guards standing near the doorway stiffened immediately. In the DeLuca household, disrespect was normally punished quickly. Even accidental disrespect. Leo's expression changed instantly. His lower lip trembled. He knew something bad was about to happen. Thomas looked down at the stain. Then he looked at Leo. For a brief second, the old Thomas DeLuca surfaced. The ruthless man who controlled a criminal empire. The man who punished mistakes harshly. But then he remembered something Catherine had said the night before. They're lonely. Thomas slowly picked up the meatball from his lap. The guards watched carefully. Leo looked like he might cry. Thomas examined the meatball thoughtfully. Then he ate it. The tension shattered. Leo blinked in confusion. Thomas wiped a drop of sauce from his shirt. Good aim, he said calmly. The guards glanced at each other in shock. Catherine smiled faintly. Thomas leaned slightly forward. But next time, he added, use a fork. Leo stared at him. Then he laughed. A small, surprised laugh. The sound filled the massive dining room. It was the first genuine laugh the house had heard in years. Thomas felt something warm rise inside his chest. Lucas slowly leaned closer. Sophia lowered her hands from her face. Catherine nudged Thomas gently under the table. Offer him a bite. Thomas picked up his fork and twirled some pasta. He held it toward Leo. Want to try mine? Leo hesitated. Then he leaned forward and took the bite. He chewed slowly. Then he whispered something that made Thomas freeze. Papa. It was the first word Leo had spoken to him in nearly 2 years. Thomas couldn't respond immediately. His throat felt tight. He simply nodded once. Catherine watched quietly. The rest of dinner was messy. Noodles ended up on the floor. Lucas spilled milk twice. Sophia demanded 3 extra napkins. But the atmosphere had changed completely. There was laughter. Noise. Small arguments about who got the last breadstick. For the first time since Elena died, the mansion felt alive. Later that evening, after the children were taken upstairs for their bath, Thomas remained alone in the dining room. He stared at the empty plates. Catherine entered carrying a tray of dishes. You did well, she said. I got attacked by spaghetti. It's a start. Thomas leaned back in his chair. You manipulated the entire room. Catherine tilted her head. No. You learn. Their eyes met across the table. For a brief moment something passed between them. Understanding. Respect. Possibility. Thomas stood slowly. You're not just a maid, he said quietly. Catherine didn't answer. But she didn't deny it either. And upstairs, for the first time in months, the triplets slept without screaming. For 3 days after the dinner, something strange began happening inside the DeLuca estate. It started quietly. Leo began speaking more. Lucas stopped hiding behind furniture when adults entered the room. And Sophia, who once refused to leave the nursery, started wandering down the hallway holding Catherine's hand. The mansion staff noticed the change immediately. So did Thomas. Every evening at 6 o'clock he sat at the same corner of the enormous dining table. Plastic plates. Messy spaghetti. Sticky hands grabbing at his sleeves. The routine felt ridiculous to the man who controlled half the city's shipping industry. But something about it mattered. More than any deal he had closed that week. Catherine watched carefully from across the table every night. She never interfered unless the children grew overwhelmed. And she never praised Thomas out loud. But sometimes she smiled quietly. That was enough. The 4th night ended peacefully. The triplets slept. The house grew silent. But sometime after midnight, Thomas sat alone in his study reviewing security reports when something unusual flickered across the surveillance monitors. He noticed it instantly. Thomas had built his empire by noticing things other people miss. Screen number 6. The camera covering the kitchen delivery entrance. The video loop repeated every 10 seconds. The same tree branch moved in the wind. The same car passed by the distant road. Over. And over. And over again. Someone had hacked the camera feed. Thomas didn't panic. Instead, he turned off the desk lamp and stood quietly. If someone had hacked the system, they might also be listening to internal communications. Calling security could alert them. He opened his desk drawer. Inside rested a matte black pistol. He checked the chamber calmly. Then he stepped into the dark hallway. The mansion felt different at night. Without lights and conversation, it felt less like a home and more like the fortress it truly was. Thomas moved silently down the stairs. Every step controlled. Every shadow watched. He bypassed the main corridor and used the servants' staircase. The kitchen level was quiet. Too quiet. The back delivery door stood slightly open. The lock had been melted with acid. Professional work. Thomas pressed his back against the wall and listened. Footsteps. Us? What? Only one intruder. The footsteps moved toward the service elevator. Thomas's eyes narrowed. That elevator led to only one place. The third floor. The nursery. Thomas pushed through the kitchen doorway instantly. Stop! The word cut through the darkness. The intruder spun around, dressed entirely in black tactical gear. A suppressed submachine gun already rising toward him. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through the kitchen wall behind Thomas. He dove behind a marble counter as stone fragments exploded into the air. Thomas fired twice. The intruder staggered slightly but didn't fall. The elevator doors began sliding shut. Not tonight, Thomas muttered. He sprinted forward and jammed his arm between the closing doors. The metal screeched. Inside the elevator, the assassin kicked his gun away. The pistol slid across the tile floor. Now it was a fight. In a space barely larger than a closet. The intruder pulled a combat knife. A blade flashed. Thomas caught the attacker's wrist and slammed it against the wall. Steel clattered against metal. The elevator jolted upward toward the third floor. They struggled violently. The knife sliced across Thomas's forearm. Blood dripped down his sleeve. He ignored it. Instead, he slammed his forehead into the attacker's mask. The assassin staggered. Thomas grabbed the mask and ripped it away. A woman? Cold gray eyes. A scar across her cheek. She smiled through blood. Too late, she whispered in Russian. She reached for something on her belt. A detonator. Thomas moved faster. He twisted her neck sharply. The body collapsed instantly. The elevator chimed. Third floor. The doors slid open. And Thomas froze again. At the end of the hallway stood Catherine. She held a table lamp like a baseball bat. Her entire body trembled. But she didn't move away from the nursery door. She was protecting it. Protecting them? Thomas stepped out of the elevator slowly. Did they wake up? He asked quietly. Catherine shook her head. No. Her eyes dropped to the body inside the elevator. Was she here for the children? Yes. Thomas kicked the detonator away. His mind already racing. Someone had sent a professional assassin. Someone who knew exactly where to go. That meant one thing. The enemy had information from inside the house. Thomas grabbed Catherine gently by the arm and pulled her away from the elevator. Don't look at the body. But Catherine had already seen enough. Her voice shook. This is because of me. Thomas frowned. What? They weren't here for you. Thomas stared at her. The pieces of the puzzle shifted inside his mind. You're going to explain that, he said quietly. Footsteps thundered up the stairs behind them. Security. Guards flooded the hallway. Weapons raised. Thomas pointed toward the elevator. Clean that up. Then he turned back to Catherine. She looked pale. Terrified. But she hadn't run. She had stood between danger and the nursery. Thomas studied her carefully. You stood guard with a lamp. Catherine looked embarrassed. It was the only thing I could grab. Thomas shook his head slightly. Most people would have hidden. I promised I would protect them. Something about that sentence hit him harder than the gunfire downstairs. Because Catherine had made that promise without contracts. Without salary negotiations. Without obligation. She had simply chosen to protect them. And in that moment Thomas realized something that frightened him far more than the assassin. This quiet woman had become the most important person inside his fortress. By morning, the DeLuca estate felt like a military base. Guards moved through the halls in pairs. Every camera in the house had been checked. The perimeter doubled. The body of the assassin had disappeared before dawn. Officially, nothing had happened. But inside the mansion, tension clung to every corner. Thomas stood in the underground security room staring at a large monitor wall. His brother Marco leaned against the table beside him. "You think the attack was about the kids?" Marco asked. Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, no." Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he studied a frozen image on the screen. A teddy bear sitting on the nursery floor. "Rewind that," he said. One of the technicians replayed the footage from the previous afternoon. Catherine walked into the nursery carrying a small basket from the agency. Inside were toys and blankets. One of them was the bear. Thomas's eyes narrowed. The screen magnified. Thomas leaned closer. There it was. A small seam on the bear's back. Too precise. Too tight. He grabbed the toy himself and carried it to the table. A pocket knife sliced through the stitching. Inside the stuffing sat a tiny metal device. A transmitter. The room went silent. Marco cursed under his breath. So the assassin tracked the signal. Thomas stared at the device. Someone had planted it. But who? The toy came with Catherine's welcome package, which meant the transmitter arrived with her. And suddenly the room felt colder. Marco spoke carefully. "You think the maid brought it?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He hated how quickly the idea made sense. But something didn't add up. Catherine had stood outside the nursery door ready to fight. People who set traps didn't usually defend their targets. The evidence sat right there on the table. Thomas exhaled slowly. "Bring her to the basement." Marco nodded. Within minutes, 2 guards escorted Catherine down the stairs. The underground holding room felt damp and cold. Concrete walls. Metal door. 1 chair. Catherine stood calmly in the center of the room. She looked exhausted from the night before but still composed. Thomas entered holding the teddy bear. He dropped it on the table in front of her. "You recognize this?" "Ness." "It came from the agency." "Ness." Thomas sliced open the seam again and pulled out the transmitter. Catherine's eyes widened instantly. "What is that?" "You tell me." Her face paled. "I've never seen that before." Thomas studied her closely. "Every twitch. Every breath. You brought this into my house." "No. It was in your basket." "I didn't pack the basket." Silence filled the room. Thomas leaned closer. "An assassin followed the signal inside this toy to my children's bedroom." Catherine's voice trembled slightly. "I swear I didn't know." Marco crossed his arms behind Thomas. "That's a very convenient story." Catherine looked between them. "If I wanted to hurt them, why would I stand in front of their door last night?" Marco shrugged. "To look innocent." Her eyes burned suddenly. "I risked my life for those children." Thomas remained quiet. The conflict inside him was growing. Logic pointed toward guilt, but instinct told him something else. He remembered the way Leo clung to her, the way Sophia refused to sleep without her nearby, the way Catherine had faced the hallway with nothing but a lamp. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Who else touched your belongings when you arrived?" Catherine thought carefully. "Your head of security." Marco frowned. "Victor?" "Yes." "He carried the basket to my room." Thomas and Marco exchanged a look. Victor had been with the family for 6 years. He handled every security check personally, which meant he also knew exactly where the cameras were. Marco spoke quietly. "You think Victor planted it?" Thomas's expression darkened. "Bring him down here." Minutes later, the metal door opened again. Victor entered confidently. How? His hand resting casually near his holster. "You wanted to see me, boss?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held up the transmitter. Victor's expression flickered for half a second. That was enough. Thomas drew his pistol instantly. The gunshot exploded in the small room. Victor dropped to his knees screaming. The bullet shattered his kneecap. Catherine gasped. Marco grabbed Victor's collar and forced him upright. Start talking. Victor's composure vanished. He offered me the territory, he shouted. Oh, a man from the Chicago outfit. What did he want? Victor's eyes darted toward Catherine. Oh, the room froze. Thomas's voice turned dangerously quiet. Explain. Victor swallowed. She testified in a trafficking case 3 years ago. Catherine looked stunned. They never found the witness who helped shut down the network, Marco said slowly. Victor nodded weakly. They've been looking for her ever since. Thomas turned slowly toward Catherine. You're the witness. Catherine didn't deny it. I didn't think they'd ever find me. Thomas lowered his gun slightly. Victor whimpered on the floor. Thomas turned back toward him. You brought killers into my house. Victor begged. They promised me the city. Thomas fired again. This time the bullet hit Victor's other leg. The screaming echoed down the hallway. Thomas handed the gun to Marco. Finish it. Marco nodded grimly as the guards dragged Victor away. Silence returned to the room. Thomas turned back to Catherine. She looked shaken. But she didn't cry. You could have told me, he said quietly. I was trying to stay invisible. Thomas shook his head slowly. That's not possible anymore. Because now, the war had officially arrived at his front door. The basement corridor grew quiet after Victor was dragged away. The echoes of his screams faded behind the heavy steel door. Thomas DeLuca stood in the center of the concrete room, staring at Catherine. For the first time since he met her, the balance of power between them had shifted. Not because he was stronger, but because he finally understood who she really was. A witness. Someone who had risked her life to help dismantle a trafficking ring that had destroyed hundreds of lives. And now those same criminals had followed her here. Into his house. Into the nursery. Into the lives of his children. Thomas exhaled slowly. You hid in my house. Catherine nodded faintly. Yes. You worked as a maid. Yes. You never told anyone who you were. No. Thomas rubbed his forehead. You do realize that if they keep coming after you, they won't care who else gets hurt. Catherine's voice was quiet. I know. Then why stay? She looked up at him. Her answer came without hesitation. Because your children needed someone. That simple sentence filled the room with silence. Thomas had spent his life surrounded by loyalty that could be bought. Soldiers paid to protect him. Lawyers paid to defend him. Politicians paid to cooperate. But Catherine had protected his children without payment. Without obligation. Without even knowing if she would survive the night. Marco finally broke the silence. So what now? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the door. Come with me, he said to Catherine. They climbed the stairs slowly. Through the quiet kitchen. Past the dark dining room. Up toward the 3rd floor. The hallway lights glowed softly. Thomas opened the nursery door. The triplets were awake. Leo stood in his crib gripping the railing. Lucas sat on the floor stacking blocks. Sophia clutched a blanket while staring at the doorway. The moment they saw Catherine, everything changed. Leo immediately reached his arms toward her. Huh! Lucas ran forward. Sophia followed, nearly tripping over the rug. Catherine knelt instantly and gathered them into her arms. 3 small bodies pressed against her like magnets. Leo buried his face into her shoulder. Lucas held her waist tightly. Sophia wrapped both arms around her neck. Thomas watched quietly from the doorway. He had never seen his children run toward anyone like that. Not even him. For years he believed money and protection were enough to give his children a good life. But now he understood something painful. They hadn't needed protection. They needed warmth. Catherine gently wiped tears from Sophia's cheek. It's all right, she whispered. I'm here. Thomas stepped into the room slowly. The children noticed him. But something had changed. Instead of shrinking away, Leo simply leaned closer to Catherine while watching his father. Lucas held Catherine's hand. Sophia studied Thomas carefully. Thomas crouched down. His massive frame looked almost awkward near the small children. "Hey," he said quietly. Leo looked at him, then pointed at Catherine. "She stays?" Thomas glanced at Catherine. She looked uncertain. For the first time since they met, she seemed unsure what to say. Thomas answered the boy gently. "Yes." Leo nodded. Satisfied, Lucas picked up a toy car and placed it on Thomas's knee. Sophia climbed onto Catherine's lap. The four of them formed a quiet circle in the middle of the nursery. Marco watched from the doorway with a slight smile. "Well," he muttered, "that's new." Thomas ignored him. Instead, he focused on Catherine. "You're not a maid anymore." Catherine looked confused. "What am I then?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "You're the only person my children trust." "That doesn't give me a title. It gives you a place in this house." Catherine studied his face. "You're offering protection." "I am offering something more important." She raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Thomas glanced at the triplets. Leo now balanced a toy block on his head. Lucas laughed. Sophia clapped. Then Thomas spoke quietly. "A choice." Catherine waited. "You can leave," he continued. "I'll arrange safe transportation, new identity, anywhere you want to go." "And if I stay?" "Then you stay because you choose to." The room grew silent again. Catherine looked at the children wrapped around her. Leo had already fallen asleep against her shoulder. Lucas leaned against her side. Sophia held her hand. Finally, Catherine smiled softly. "I think they already decided." Thomas felt something unfamiliar rise in his chest. Relief. For years he believed power meant controlling everything around him. But now he understood something far more complicated. The most powerful decision in the room was Catherine's. Weeks passed. The DeLuca estate slowly changed. Dinner remained chaotic. Spaghetti still flew occasionally. But the children laughed more. Leo spoke more words. Lucas began drawing pictures. Sophia started sleeping without nightmares. And every evening at 6 o'clock, the most feared man in the city sat at a table covered in plastic plates while 3 toddlers argued about dessert. One evening, Thomas stood in the garden watching the children play. Catherine sat nearby reading a book while Sophia climbed onto her lap. Marco approached quietly. "You know the city is talking," he said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About the maid who changed the dawn." Thomas looked toward Catherine. She noticed him watching and smiled slightly. He shook his head. "She didn't change me." Marco laughed. "Sure she didn't." Thomas watched Leo run across the grass toward him. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. And sometimes the strongest person in the room wasn't the man with the empire. It was the quiet woman who chose kindness when no one expected it. Because power can force obedience, but only compassion can build a family. And that was the night the most dangerous man in the city realized something important. The maid he thought he had hired had actually saved his house, and perhaps his heart. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about courage, loyalty, and unexpected heroes. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story.